Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Let me just, before I begin on what I want to speak about, make a few kind of preliminary comments which vary from being entirely irrelevant to what I want to speak about to slightly relevant. Firstly, when I arrived this morning and sat in the chair that the minister is sitting in now, that's not relevant, I actually felt a bit of a shiver going down my spine as I considered what a few centuries ago might have happened in this room. Fires burning on the two sides, perhaps dancing or big fancy dinner, while a couple of stories down were slave prisoners who quite conceivably might have been the ancestors of some of us here. I think it's a very, very vivid thought to keep in mind, not only today. And while this is one of the more irrelevant points to what I want to say, I think it has great relevance to the issues that we are discussing today. Secondly, firstly, I should have said that from the Afro-Middle East Center, I'm very pleased to have been involved in this symposium today and collaborating with IPSA in order to pull it off. I think this is a very important symposium, and the importance goes beyond today. Thirdly, I'm very pleased to be speaking on a panel before the minister arrived, a panel of 6 people, as it was supposed to be, including the chairperson, of which 4 women. That's very heartwarming, and particularly that most of them are young women and accomplished young women. I think is great example for how we should be, as a Muslim community, conducting our events. Lastly, let me also take the opportunity to make a point about Wasatiyyah, Sheikh Ihsan. I concur with what Ibrahim said earlier on the notion of taking the literal meaning of the word wasata. There's also another literal meaning of the word wasata, and that is the center, to be at the center. Middle, yes, but the center. When you're at the center, it also gives you a sense, I don't know if Sheikh Siraj is still here, but of not a linear kind of spectrum, but perhaps a circle. And so being at the center as a responsibility for Muslims means being at the center of the action. That when whatever you're talking about, and in this case we're talking about extremism, is the issue of the day, that we cannot stand aside. You can't pretend to be moderate or in the middle, but standing aside. You have to be in the center of the action. That is what is also implied by the notion of wasata. So wasata is not a passive moderation, if you like. It is an active engagement from a balanced perspective. Sorry, Ibrahim, just to throw in my own tafsir into it after stripping the other tafsirs aside. The topic that we have is really, Rashid, quite a mouthful. Why a research agenda tackling Muslim extremism, moderating media hysteria, identifying root causes, and mitigating the effects? And so let me say at the beginning that I'm not going to be able to speak on that. But that we need careful and good research on this particular issue in general, but on this particular issue that we're talking about, that point cannot be overemphasized. We looking at an issue, and I think Khadija kind of illustrated that to some extent, an issue that is blown in all kinds of different proportions, that by the end of the discussion, unless one carefully picks out what we're talking about, doesn't necessarily mean too much, except that it's very scary. And I don't think that we want to be in a situation where we simply are scared. That we should be understanding what we are doing. Understanding what you're doing also tramps on lots of people's toes. So as an example, last year the Afro-Middle East Center organized an entire 2-day conference on ISIS, not on extremism, just on ISIS. What it is, what does it do, how does it recruit, who are its people, what does its state do, how is it structured, etc. The result of that, I thought, was great. We had a great conference. But another result of that was at least one Muslim embassy that has been telling people that AMEC is an ISIS front. So before that, by the way, the same embassy had been telling people that we are Muslim Brotherhood front. So it's quite nice to, be fingered as fronts for a whole range of different groups. The point about this is that unless we know what we're talking about, how do we then think of challenging, attacking, criticizing this thing that whatever it is that we are talking about? So let me give you an example that came out of that conference, but also, this is something that at our center we follow on an ongoing basis. Rubbishing the notion of ISIS being a state is useful from various perspectives, but it's also necessary to understand what it means when it says that it is a state. And I can give you examples based on good research of how ISIS actually has been, until a few months ago, let's say until 6 months, 9 months ago, has actually been operating as a state. I read an article just last week about pharmacy regulations in ISIS-controlled territory, on the kinds of regulations they have in terms of who can operate, who can work as a pharmacist, what qualifications are required, how your pharmacist, your pharmacy, what kind of medicines it's allowed, what are the punishments for selling expired medicines, etc. I'm saying all this not necessarily to normalize the group. I'm saying all this because, as I said, if you want to know what you're dealing with, then you have to understand it properly. And so the issue of research is extremely important, detailed research, not vague ideas about it, and throwing vague ideas into pigeonholes with particular labels is extremely unhelpful. It is what happens, or the consequence of that kind of thing we have seen in our community in this country. This morning we heard of how people get labeled with labels of bid'ah and kufr, but here also a few years ago, Ahmadi sympathizer, all of these things we need to be very careful about and understand what we're talking about before we start throwing that around. And so that brings me also to the issue of language. I'm a little more comfortable using the term extremism than I would be using many other terms. But it's also interesting, and we need to interrogate all the terminology that we use. It's interesting how in the global discourse, this phenomenon that we're talking about has moved from what was not too long ago terrorism to now extremism. And so dealing with it has been initially anti-terrorism, then it became countering violent extremism, and now the discourse is around preventing violent extremism. Do you know what preventing violent extremism means in many European countries? It means that kids, and this I'm not making this up, in the UK, a child of 4 years old was reported to the police for something he or she said in class. A child of 6 who I think wanted to say tourist, how his family were tourists and said terrorist instead, misspelled, but still you can see it said terrorist, was reported to the police. Where in the US, kids making clocks are regarded as a threat. This is what preventing violent extremism means. It is thought policing. Not dealing with actions that are problematic, but the fact that you might have an idea that could lead to thinking about an action that might be problematic is in itself problematic. And I think that we have a constitution that certainly should be preventing us from moving that far in that direction. But that is the discourse that exists internationally. I have in the past, just this year, so in the past 4 months or so, attended 2 or 3 closed meetings or open conferences dealing with this issue of countering violent extremism and preventing violent extremism, and what kind of role we as South Africa should be playing in this discourse. And it's highly problematic because it's almost entirely imported. almost entirely has nothing to do with relating to the context in which we live in, and certainly has to be challenged. And perhaps I would venture to say that buying into some of that discourse is as dangerous as allowing the discourse of the Islamic State group to propagate itself in our country. Part of the topic is also around media hysteria, and I think that Khadija spoke to that issue. But let me make a couple of complementary points on that issue. Let me start on that by giving you two small stories, and I'm not going to give you the stories, but the one story which I'm sure you all know is the incident of who has been dubbed the Cape Town girl. You know the story. She jumped on a plane, got stopped by state security, returned to her family, all of that. She's from Cape Town, hence Cape Town girl, of course, sorry. The second story is the story of the 23 from Roshni who left to join ISIS. You all know that story? Who hasn't heard of that story? Great, okay. I'm not sure if you remember the media coverage of those two stories. The Cape Town girl story happened before the other one, okay? There was, I would say, really hysteria in the media. It was a huge thing, blown, in my view, out of proportion. By the way, it wasn't the first incident. There were a number of other incidents. State security dealt with it in the same kind of way. It just didn't come to the media's attention. So this one got all of this attention, talk shows about it, and all kinds of things. Shafiq, I'm sure you did one or two interviews about it too. Then the other story was the Roshni story. The Roshni story, by the way, was uncovered the first journalist to uncover that story was Khadija and her partner in Daily Vox at the time, Azad Isa. They were working on an article about it for Al Jazeera. And that's how we came to know of what had happened. There was an intervention in that case. Some people in Johannesburg, Khadija being one of them, who, journalists are very jealous when they're not going to let it out to anyone. Khadija agreed to be part of a group that met with journalists, even compromising her scoop, by the way. Maulana Suleiman Rawat was part of that group, one or two other people, called up a briefing with editors and met about a dozen journalists, some of them editors, some of them deputy editors, etc., none of whom had heard about the story yet. Al Jazeera was going to run the story the day after or 2 days after that meeting. And we said to them, this is an off-the-record briefing. Here's Khadija, who has done the story. She's done the research. She gave a full briefing about what had happened. Maulana Rawat, who's from Radio Islam, another media agency, spoke about perspectives of what had happened. 23 South Africans in one go had gone to Turkey to join ISIS. The media response to that was much more, I think you'd agree, Maulana, much more sensible, much more measured, much more factual, and much more careful than the incident of the one girl a few weeks earlier. Okay? The lesson is that while I might agree, while I do agree with Khadija about some of the hysteria in the media, and the examples she gave are entirely valid, that in order to deal with the media properly around these issues, we need to treat the media not as the enemy, but as part of our society that needs to be engaged, and engaged properly and respectfully. If you engage them respectfully, they give you the same respect back, like all normal human beings. Some of us are not that normal, but like all normal human beings. No cooperation and silence, as far as the media is concerned, means that when there's a hint, what? 1 minute? When there's a hint of a story, that they're going to be desperate enough to go to any clown that's willing to give them a comment. And some of those clowns include the kind of person that Khadija mentioned, who had written a column for them. I spoke with the same person on a panel a few days ago and heard exactly the same, that's how I knew who she was talking about. Exactly the same thing. South Africa is now moving from being simply a place where extremists come to hang out to now a place where there's going to be operations taking place. What's the basis of your argument? Well, nothing really. She happened to interview 8 people, 5 of whom, this person says, she managed to convince not to become extremists. This is the extent of the research. This person, by the way, goes on the media all over the place with the same argument. Let me talk quickly now in the 45 seconds I have left. Root causes of, now when we talk about the root causes and attraction to those who get recruited, particularly we're talking now about the Islamic State group, we must be contextual. We must understand different contexts and how it happens in different contexts. South Africa is not France. Muslim youth in South Africa are not alienated from the rest of South African society. They're not marginalized in such a way that they have a crisis of identity. Those are not the reasons why South African Muslims join ISIS, and they're not that many. You know, we think about 80 South Africans. Those are not the reasons. In South Africa, the reasons are actually much more serious. Not saying that a crisis of identity is not serious, but in South Africa, we would say, two main reasons for why people get attracted to such a group. One is political. The notion that, look what is happening to Muslims in Palestine and Iraq and here, there, everywhere, and all of that, and something needs to be done, and the only guys who have the capacity to do anything is these guys. Okay, that argument might be faltering a bit at the moment, but let's say 6 months ago, it seemed like a valid argument to some. So one is the political argument. The other argument is a theological one, and of course there's overlap between the two. And the theological argument is all us Muslims know that the political ideal for us is a caliphate, and here we now have a caliphate. This guy's declared himself a Khalifa. I've thought carefully about it. He's right. We must all rally to him, and our only options are to make hijrah to the Caliphate. Okay? So it's a political and a theological kind of attraction. And so therefore you'll find that unlike many of the stories you hear about recruits in Europe, for example, the recruits from South Africa are much smarter in terms of understanding the arguments, understanding the theology, understanding what they're getting themselves into. Than some of these stories you hear about, recruits who can't even read the Quran and all of that. It's a bit different. Who are these people that are joining the Islamic State group from South Africa? Again, let's be careful that we don't use the same kind of characterizations as in other places. In South Africa, they're not mainly converts. Yes, there have been converts, what my ex-wife, who herself is a convert, calls convertitis. Some of them are, but the majority of them have not been converts. The majority of them have not been poor working class people, they've been middle class people. The majority of them have been young, but not all of them have been young. Many of them have gone as families. The most famous one, I think, is the man from the Eastern Cape who's, in his mid to late 60s, I think. He didn't go there to fight. He went there because this was a political and theological ideal. He went there and he became a teacher. Others went there and did other things. Okay, so these are the kinds of people you're talking about. I'm going to let me just make one more point. I'm going to cut out everything else and make this one point, and that is that. Thank you, Minister, for your speech, but I just want to add to that. The position that the South African government has taken is not to go down the line of CVE, PVE, and all of that. It is a very different position, and I think it is a position that we need to consider carefully. That, in the words of Minister Mahlobo when he spoke at our conference last year, that the South African government believes that the way to deal with this is more through persuasion than prosecution. Which means, of course, that the responsibility for dealing with this is more, the people sitting in this room than this minister sitting here. Okay? That the root of this is an ideological one, and that's where you have to deal with it, not the state. That locking people up, detaining them, prosecuting them is not going to solve the problem. And so, of those 23 that went, you know that 11 were stopped by the Turks and sent back. They were interrogated, interviewed, whatever you like, for a couple of hours by state security and released. Then another 11, 12, 13 of them came back voluntarily. They were actually assisted to return by the South African government. And when they did get back, they were interrogated for a couple of hours and then released. I'm pretty sure that most of them are under surveillance, but they've not been locked up. And so what does that mean then in terms of the responsibility that those Muslim leaders, in quotes, who met with Minister Mahlobo and accepted this responsibility, what responsibility does it mean for them and for the rest of us in terms of dealing with this issue? And let me end on this note, that the other responsibility that we have, and the challenge, I think a very positive challenge, that groups like the Islamic State group pose for us, is that we need to rethink what we mean by Islam. You know, Ibrahim, when you spoke about my slight concern about your speech this morning, and it's not your speech because you were locating things in a contemporary context, but it seemed by the end of it that you were suggesting, which you are not, that you were suggesting that all of these right-wing tendencies in Europe and North America have just suddenly sprung up. The seeds of those have been there in the Democratic Party in the US, in the Labour Party and the establishment and the media in Europe, in the UK, etc., have been there. And so the seeds of the Islamic State group is in our theology. The fact that, as you said, Ibrahim, the way we deal with women, the way we talk about non-Muslims, kuffar, okay, the way we exclude people, the way we talk about Shias, all of this is what leads to so if you want, the way we think of the notion of Khalifat, 90% I would say, no statistics, no research on this, but I'd say at least 90% of Muslims around the world think that our ideal is a Khalifat. I don't, okay? We need to re-interrogate every one of these things and our basic ideology and theology if we want to deal long-term with the kind of extremist thought that we're talking about. Thank you.